Whilst the sponge is cooling, we then prepare the filling. The cherries need to be drained and cut in half, but remember to keep 10 whole ones for the decoration at the end. With some of the juice, we need to add that to the corn flour to make a slurry. When using corn flour, the liquid must always be cold. It needs to be blended until it's lump-free and nice and smooth. Bring the rest of the juice to the boil, and once boiling, add the slurry and mix until well combined. Allow the sauce to thicken and cook out for a few minutes on the stove. This is so that the starch has completely thickened all of the juice and it doesn't have a floury texture. Then place the half cherries into the warm juice that has been thickened and stir until all cherries are coated. This will stop the cherries from falling out of the gateau once placed between the cream when it's built in layers. Allow this to cool down whilst preparing the rest of the mise en place. So now we'll make the sugar syrup that's going to soak the sponge. It's sugar and water, and then when it's cooked we'll add the kirsch after. So we place the sugar and the water onto the boil, and you need to watch this very carefully because you do not want to caramelise or burn the sugar. Once the sugar is dissolved and it's come to the boil, we then remove from the heat and add the kirsch. Allow the syrup to cool down before using to soak the sponge. Now the génoise is completely cold, we're going to cut it to the size that we need for the gâteau. We do this firstly by taking off the top to make sure that the cake is nice and level to begin. Be careful when rotating the sponge and place your hand on the top as the knife comes through so that you do not cut yourself. The sponge needs to be to the half of the height of the original cake ring. Put the cake ring next to the sponge and then measure halfway. Cut the sponge so that we can have one solid piece to cut into 3 layers. You may be able to cut 4 pieces of sponge from your génoise if you've got good volume. Keep that piece and put it to one side. That can be used for other gâteaux. Now we're measuring the sponge. You can see it's only half the height of the cake ring. Take the clean cake ring and lightly spray with canola spray. This will make it easier to remove the cake ring once the gâteau has been built and chilled. Place onto a cake board onto a clean tray. Then proceed to cut the cake into 3 even layers in the same method as what we previously did. Be very, very careful as this is hard because the layers are much thinner. Make sure the knife goes forward and back as you rotate the sponge. That way you will create nice even layers. Now you have 3 even layers. We place them on top of each other again. Now we will take the outer crust off very carefully to make the size of the sponge slightly smaller than the cake ring. We do this by holding the knife straight and cutting on an angle by rotating the sponge. Again, do not take too much sponge off because you will make the disc of sponge too small for the inside of the cake. Once you have trimmed the sponge, we can now start to build the layers. Place the first disc into the bottom of the cake ring. By trimming the sponge, it will leave a centimetre gap between the ring and the sponge. This means that when the cream is piped in, you will not see the chocolate sponge through the cream on the finished product. Now the kirsch syrup is cold, we soak the sponge using a pastry brush. This is to add flavour to the sponge and also to add a little bit of extra moisture. Do not oversaturate the sponge, but make sure that all parts of the sponge are evenly covered. There should be enough syrup in this recipe for all 3 layers. Now we're going to whip the whipping cream and caster sugar to soft peak. It's very important at this stage not to over whip the cream. we're going to be adding some melted gelatine. The gelatin mixture is melted in a bain-marie so that the gelatin doesn't get too hot. Before the cream reaches soft peak, take a little bit of cream out of the machine and add the melted gelatin. Make sure that it's blended well before adding back to the rest of the cream. By doing this, it will prevent gelatin lumps setting in the cold cream. Once the cream is blended, place back into the machine bowl and continue whisking to the soft peak. If the cream is not at the stage that you want it to be, check using a scraper to see how soft it is, and then use a hand whisk just to thicken it to the soft peak consistency. It should be firm enough to hold on the whisk so that you can place it in a piping bag and it's not going to run out. Fill the piping bag with the correctly whipped cream. Hold the piping bag halfway down your hand so that the mixture doesn't fall out and make a mess. Do not overfill the bag and gently squeeze out any air. You can see the mixture is not dripping and it's pipeable. Pipe the cream into the edge of the cake ring so that that centimetre is now covered, and then just pipe circles onto the disc of sponge before placing in the cherries of the filling. You have to do 2 layers, so just use half of the cherries. Then pipe the cream directly on top of the cherries before placing the next layer of sponge onto the cream. Using a flat hand, press the sponge down onto the cream and the cherries. This will push the cream to the outside of the ring, but the cherries need to stay in the centre, so be careful not to press too hard. It is important to press down firmly so that the finished sponge just is in line with the top of the ring. Repeat the process with the syrup and create the second layer exactly the same as what you've just seen. When you place the final disc of sponge on top of the cherries, press firmly so it fits just below the top of the cake ring. This will enable enough space for the cream to go on the top for the final presentation. On the top of the cake, place enough cream so that we can cover the whole of the sponge. Use a palette knife to spread the cream and try not to make a mess of the edges. Go gently backwards and forwards without bringing the crumb from the sponge into the cream, as this will affect the overall appearance. Scrape off the excess cream using your palette knife and flick it off the edge of the cake ring. This will give the finished product a nice flat appearance. Once this is done, place in the chiller to set. Once the cake is set, remove from the chiller and take off the tray. Turn the tray over and remove the paper from the base of the cake board. This is really important so that you can place a chocolate decoration on after. To remove the cake ring, heat a clean tea towel under hot water and place around the outside of the ring. Make sure that you do not touch the top of the cake. Alternatively, you can use a blowtorch. However, this can be a little bit fierce and can melt the cream. After a few seconds, remove the cloth carefully. Using both hands, lift the ring directly up without going at an angle, because you don't want to disturb the nice flat finish. Now you can see how building the cake inside the cake ring gives you nice smooth edges and a nice flat surface. We have to portion this cake into 10 without cutting. Place your knife onto the top of the cake without much pressure. Mark it as if it was cutting in half. Slightly rotate the cake, imagine a portion, and make it into equal halves again. Rotate the cake again and the two larger portions mark in half, and the same for the other portions that are left. This will now give you 10 portions. This is not easy, so I would recommend you try it on a piece of paper with a pen first. Place the cake to one side in the fridge before preparing the collar for the outside decoration. To ensure the chocolate collar is the right height for the cake, measure the side of the cake ring for the depth. The ruler that I'm using is actually the same width as the depth of the ring, but always take the measurement first so that you can be sure it's not going to be too high or too low. Place the ruler on the sheet of silicone paper and mark the guideline of the width. Fold the paper over and then use a sharp knife to cut a nice neat strip. Double check the measurements to make sure that the paper has actually been marked correctly. Measure twice and cut once. Be careful when cutting the paper. Keep your hand flat on top of the paper and slide a sharp knife carefully away from your hand. Using a clean cake ring, take the large sheet of paper around the outside of the cake ring. Fold when it meets the edge and then trim off the excess paper so that the collar will be a perfect fit. You must do this before you start flicking the chocolate across the silicone paper. Check the measurement again, and now you can see that it's the perfect height and it fits around the outside of the cake. Now place the strip of paper on a sheet of silicone paper to prevent making a mess on the bench. The melted compound chocolate should not be too hot and should not have any crystallization in it. This is done by melting over a bain-marie without allowing any steam or excessive heat to come into contact with the chocolate. The chocolate should be nice and fluid. To prepare a piping bag, fold a sheet of silicone paper in half and make a firm seam. With a sharp knife, cut the paper in half along the edge with your hand flat on top and the knife away from you. Then take the piece of paper and make a right angle. You'll notice that you have two triangle shapes with one straight edge. Cut a nice seam with a sharp knife again without any ripped pieces. You take the corner with the cut-off point to the centre and then you wrap the long piece around the back and collect with your fingers at the back. Pull all of the pieces of paper together, fold them into the centre of the cornet, and on the opposite side of the open seam make a little tear and fold down the silicone paper. This will secure the cone with a sharp point and stop the opening of the piping bag when the chocolate is added. Always place the chocolate in the piping bag using a small spoon and not a large spatula. We want the piping bag to be filled only halfway. Too much chocolate in the piping bag will result in a messy chocolate bag and the decoration will be affected. Fold the corners of the bag into the centre on the opposite side of the seam. This will prevent the chocolate from leaking out. Fold down to the centre, which will apply a little bit of pressure, which will make it easier to pipe. Cut the end of the piping bag off just to a small hole so that the chocolate decoration will be piped nice and delicately. Test the bag to make sure that there's no blockage. Then evenly and quickly flick the chocolate backwards and forwards in one direction along the strip of the paper, keeping it as close as possible but not worrying about trying to keep it into the actual size of the paper. Once you get to the end, you change the direction and you pipe exactly the same in the opposite direction. This is now forming the pattern for the colour around the outside of the contemporary Black Forest Gateau. Once the chocolate has been piped, you will need to get your Gateau in place so that you can lift the chocolate strip and place around the outside carefully. You will need to reposition the Gateau closer to your body so that when you lift the chocolate strip, you're able to wrap it around the cake without it damaging the decoration. So we lift the strip of paper with the chocolate decoration on and we hold it tightly at either end of the strip. Very carefully drop it to the base of the tray, maintaining the tightness of the strip of paper. With your left or your right hand, wrap one piece around the cake just to meet in the middle at the front. Very carefully hold the other side of the paper nice and tight and wrap it around the cake and join in the centre. Do not touch the chocolate strip once it's on the cake, otherwise the pattern will be destroyed. Place in the fridge or the blast chiller for the chocolate decoration to set. Whilst the chocolate decoration is set in, we can now melt our flan gel. This flan gel is just a combination of water and flan gel that's boiled up and then allowed to cool slightly, but must still be a liquid. The cherries are then dipped into some of the flan gel and placed onto some silicone paper to set. This is going to seal in any excess juice that remains and give a nice shiny appearance to the cherry on each portion at the end of the decorated cake. The reason why we put small amounts of gel in a tub is so that the rest of the gel does not get contaminated with the colour or flavourings of the fruit. If the gel starts to set because it's too cold, simply place it in a bain-marie to remelt or bring it back to the boil and allow to cool. Now that the chocolate has set, we can carefully remove the silicone strip of paper from the cake. Slowly peel the edge to make sure that the chocolate remains on the cream. Rotate the tray and pull the paper gently. This should come away easily if the chocolate is set. If it is not coming away and it is sticking, replace it back in the fridge or the chiller for the chocolate to set more. When you get to the end, be extra careful that it hasn't underlapped into the chocolate and pull away rather than around the cake. Now you have a nice neat pattern from the paper onto the Gateau at the right height. With the remainder of the cream, using the same piping bag, pipe even bulbs of cream into each portion. Ensure that the cream is in the widest part of the portion, not off the edge or not too close to the centre, as this will affect the overall appearance of the cake. Now taking a clean cutter, place into the centre of the cake. This is where we will place the grated chocolate into the centre. This makes it easier to just put the right amount of grated chocolate in the centre without sprinkling on the outside, making a mess of your nice clean decoration. The Gateau is now starting to come together. Before lifting the ring off, make sure that there's sufficient chocolate so that you don't have to touch it too much once you move the ring. If you put too much chocolate in the centre, when you lift it up, it will spill everywhere. Lift the ring carefully straight up so that the chocolate doesn't spill. Now we dust with icing sugar, which will represent the snow in the forest of the Black Forest region. Very carefully, take the glazed cherries and place on top of the cream. Your Gateau is almost finished. Make sure you gently push the cherry onto the cream without pushing the cream too far and making a mess. If you don't push the cherry a little bit, it will roll off when you try to cut the cake or move it. Now your Gateau is complete. After leaving the gateau in the fridge for a little while to set further, place a sharp knife down the centre and cut carefully without disturbing the outside decoration. This can then be plated up as a portion and served to the customer. It is important to use a sharp, clean knife when portioning the gateau. The gateau must be set sufficiently so that when you cut you do not disturb the nice neat layers of sponge, cream and cherries. Gateau is a French term used for the word cake.